3 days after my neighborhood association demanded a complete list of every person I had invited to Thanksgiving dinner, they were staring at federal investigators walking through the front door of their office. And the funny part was, they still thought I was the one in trouble. They had absolutely no idea that for almost 3 decades I had built my career around one thing: recognizing exactly when ordinary people with a little authority crossed the line into something the federal government took very, very seriously. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 59 years old, retired now, and for the first time in almost 30 years, I thought I was finally living the quiet life I'd earned. My wife used to joke that after spending decades reading legal briefs, interviewing witnesses, and chasing discrimination cases across 3 states, I'd probably spend retirement reading fishing magazines and arguing with squirrels over the bird feeder. Honestly, she wasn't completely wrong. We had settled into a neighborhood called Willow Creek Preserve just outside Richmond, Virginia. It wasn't extravagant, just one of those clean suburban communities where everyone waved from the driveway, trimmed their lawns every Saturday morning, and pretended HOA meetings were about landscaping instead of politics. At least that's what I believed when I bought the place 2 years earlier. Looking back now, I realize neighborhoods don't reveal their personalities immediately. They wait until they think you're comfortable. It was the Monday before Thanksgiving when everything started. I walked down the driveway with a cup of coffee, expecting bills, grocery coupons, maybe another flyer about holiday decorations. Instead, there was a certified envelope sitting in my mailbox. I remember laughing because certified mail usually means somebody wants your attention more than you want theirs. The return address read Willow Creek Preserve Homeowners Association. I signed for it at the post office later that afternoon, opened it in my kitchen, and almost dropped my reading glasses. According to the letter, I owed $2,500 for repeated unauthorized guest violations. I actually read that sentence 3 times because I honestly thought it had to be a typo. Unauthorized guests. My brother and his wife had driven down from Pennsylvania. My daughter was bringing 2 college roommates who couldn't afford flights home. My next-door neighbor, Frank, was coming over to watch football before dinner like he had the year before. That was apparently enough to make me a neighborhood criminal. I flipped through the packet expecting photographs or complaints about noise, parking, litter, something that at least made sense. Instead, there was a typed demand stating that within 48 hours I had to submit the full names, home addresses, and relationship to homeowner for every person expected to enter my property during Thanksgiving weekend. If I failed to comply, another $750 would be added along with legal processing fees, and the association would begin procedures to place a lien against my home. I leaned back in my chair thinking there had to be some misunderstanding because no reasonable person writes something like that with a straight face. So I called the HOA office. A woman answered after the second ring. Her voice had that polished confidence you hear from people who spent years believing nobody ever questions them. Association office. This is Linda Cross. I introduced myself and explained I had received what had to be a mistake. There was a brief pause before she replied. Mr. Mercer, your file is right here. There is no mistake. I asked her to explain exactly what rule I had violated. She started reading from the community handbook in that slow, rehearsed voice people use when they think quoting paperwork automatically wins the argument. According to her interpretation, the board had authority to monitor guest activity to protect neighborhood security. I interrupted and asked the obvious question. Since when does security require knowing my daughter's roommate's home address? Another pause. Then her tone changed. Colder, sharper. Certain homeowners have demonstrated patterns of inviting individuals who don't reflect the standards this community was built upon. I didn't say anything for a second because sometimes silence tells you more than words. Then I asked, what exactly does that mean? She sighed like I was forcing her to explain something obvious. People notice these things. Mr. Mercer, visitors who don't really fit here. We're simply preserving the character of Willow Creek. There it was. Not shouted, not hidden, just quietly slipped into the conversation like it belonged there. I've heard sentences like that hundreds of times in my career. Different wording, same meaning. People who don't fit here. I looked at the family photos hanging in my kitchen. My daughter had married into a Puerto Rican family. My closest friends included former coworkers from every background imaginable. Thanksgiving at our house had always looked like America actually looks, not some brochure from the 1950s. Linda probably expected me to argue. Instead, I thanked her for clarifying the board's position. She sounded almost disappointed. Before hanging up, she added one last warning. 48 hours, mister. Mercer. After that, attorneys become involved. I smiled to myself after the call ended because she had unknowingly reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten during retirement. I wasn't just some homeowner receiving an unreasonable letter. For 28 years, I had investigated housing discrimination cases for a living. I knew exactly what evidence sounded like before it even reached paper. That evening, my wife walked into the study carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She found me opening an old storage box I hadn't touched since retirement. Inside were notebooks, legal reference binders, case summaries, and contact cards from people I hadn't spoken to in months. She leaned against the doorway and smiled. "Please tell me you're not about to go back to work." I looked up, smiled back, and quietly answered, "No, but I think work just came looking for me." The first thing I did the next morning was something most people probably wouldn't have expected. I didn't call a lawyer because I already knew enough lawyers. I didn't drive to the HOA office because emotional confrontations almost never produce useful evidence. And I definitely didn't start posting angry messages on neighborhood Facebook pages because public outrage has a funny way of warning people before investigators ever arrive. Instead, I made breakfast, fed the birds in the backyard, and spent nearly an hour watching a pair of cardinals argue over the feeder while I organized my thoughts. My wife knew that look on my face. She had seen it dozens of times over the years whenever a case started coming together inside my head. "You're building a timeline," she said. I nodded. "Always start with the timeline." By 9 o'clock, I had called someone I hadn't spoken to since my retirement party 18 months earlier. Her name was Melissa Grant, my former legal assistant. Melissa had an almost supernatural talent for organizing mountains of paperwork into stories that judges could understand in 5 minutes. She answered on the second ring and laughed before I even finished introducing myself. "Daniel, either you're bored in retirement or somebody made a terrible mistake." "The second one," I answered. 20 minutes later, I scanned every page the HOA had mailed me and sent it over. Less than an hour passed before my phone rang again. Melissa didn't bother with small talk. "This isn't just aggressive," she said quietly. "This is dangerous." She had noticed the same sentence I had. Buried in the middle of the notice were the association justified collecting personal information to preserve neighborhood standards. Most people would read right past those words. We didn't. We'd spend years learning that discrimination almost never introduces itself loudly anymore. It hides behind phrases that sound polite until you ask one simple question. Standards for whom? Character according to whom? Community values decided by whom? Once those questions start getting answers, everything changes. Before noon, I pulled out every HOA letter I had ever received. Most were harmless reminders about mulch colors or seasonal maintenance. But one thing immediately caught my attention. Every violation notice carried Linda Cross's signature, yet none of them had ever been approved during an open board meeting. That was unusual. Curious. I walked across the street to visit Frank, my retired Marine neighbor. Frank had lived in Willow Creek Preserve for almost 12 years. He welcomed me inside before I even knocked twice. We sat on his back porch drinking iced tea while I casually asked whether he'd ever received guest violation notices. Frank looked genuinely confused. "Guest notices? Never." I explained what had happened. He frowned. "That's strange." Then he hesitated. "You know, now that I think about it, I've noticed they only seem to bother certain families." That sentence stayed with me. I asked him what he meant. Frank scratched his chin before answering carefully. "Remember the Patel family over on Cedar Lane? They kept getting letters every holiday. Then there was the Ramirez family. Same thing, couple down near the entrance. The Ngayans. They were always arguing with the board over visitors." He paused again. "Funny thing is, the Johnsons throw graduation parties every summer with 50 people parked all over the street and nobody says a word." There it was again. Not proof, but a pattern. Patterns are where investigations begin. Over the next 2 days, I quietly visited 6 more homeowners. I never told them what I thought was happening because good investigators don't plant ideas in witnesses. I simply asked about their experiences. Some conversations lasted 5 minutes. Others stretched nearly 2 hours over coffee and family stories. An elderly widow named Maria Alvarez disappeared into her bedroom and returned carrying a shoebox filled with HOA letters. She had saved every single one for nearly 6 years because, as she put it, something about them never felt right. Inside that box were notices questioning overnight guests, demanding explanations for visiting relatives, asking who was staying at the house during Christmas, Easter, birthdays, always the same families, never everyone. just certain households. Another homeowner, Dr. Ahmed Hassan, showed me emails requesting identification for cousins visiting from Chicago. A Korean-American couple described board members photographing cars parked outside during Lunar New Year celebrations. A Jamaican family told me neighbors openly warned them not to invite too many outsiders because the HOA president disliked unfamiliar faces. Every conversation added another piece to the picture. Nobody alone had enough evidence to prove discrimination. Together, they had something much larger. That Friday afternoon, I spread everything across the dining room table: letters, emails, meeting notices, photographs, dates, addresses, family names. My wife walked into the room, looked at the organized piles, and quietly asked, "How bad is it?" I took a deep breath before answering, "Worse than I expected." I highlighted every documented guest complaint over the past 5 years. Then I compared those addresses against publicly available property records. The results were almost unbelievable. Nearly every enforcement action involving guest restrictions targeted households with ethnic surnames or multicultural families. Meanwhile, dozens of nearly identical gatherings hosted by other residents generated no citations whatsoever. The numbers weren't just suspicious. They were statistically impossible to explain away as coincidence. Melissa called again that evening. After reviewing everything, she simply said, "Daniel, it's time." She already knew what I meant. We spent 3 hours preparing a referral package. No emotional language. No accusations. Just facts, timelines, supporting documents, and a concise explanation describing why the evidence suggested a pattern of discriminatory housing practices. Saturday morning, I uploaded every document through the proper federal reporting channels, then sent duplicate copies to 2 regional offices responsible for fair housing enforcement. When I finally clicked send, I didn't feel triumphant. I actually felt strangely calm. Whatever happened next would no longer depend on me. The system I had trusted for decades would decide whether the evidence deserved attention. Thanksgiving arrived before anyone responded. My family came anyway. My brother carved the turkey. My daughter laughed louder than anyone else in the room. Her husband spent an hour teaching my 8-year-old nephew how to throw a football in the backyard. Friends drifted in and out carrying pies, casseroles, bottles of wine, ridiculous stories from college, and enough desserts to feed half the county. At one point, I stood in the kitchen looking around the room and realized exactly why Linda's comments had bothered me so deeply. This wasn't just about paperwork. It wasn't about guest lists. It was about somebody believing they deserved to decide which families looked acceptable and which ones required monitoring. That's a dangerous idea, no matter where it begins. 3 days after Thanksgiving, my cell phone rang while I was replacing a broken fence latch. The caller ID displayed a Washington area code I recognized immediately. I answered without saying much. A woman introduced herself as Senior Investigator Rebecca Collins with the Office of Fair Housing. Her voice was calm, professional, almost detached. "Mr. Mercer, we've completed an initial review of the materials you submitted." She paused just long enough for my heart rate to climb. "We'd like to request every supporting document you still have." I asked whether that meant they were opening an investigation. Another brief silence followed. "Officially, I can't discuss procedural decisions over the phone." Then her tone softened just enough to reveal what she couldn't formally say. "Unofficially, don't throw anything away." Within 48 hours, secure transfer links arrived requesting additional records. Melissa helped organize thousands of pages. We included correspondence, archived newsletters, board election results, public meeting minutes, violation histories, neighborhood maps, and sworn statements from homeowners willing to cooperate. The package grew larger every hour. A week later, Rebecca called again. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "our team will be conducting on-site interviews beginning Monday." I thanked her and ended the call. My wife looked up from the living room sofa. "Well?" she asked. I smiled for the first time since opening that certified letter. "They're coming." By Monday morning, 2 unmarked government vehicles quietly pulled into Willow Creek Preserve. Nobody noticed at first. Then investigators walked straight past the holiday wreaths hanging on the HOA office door, carrying leather briefcases and official credentials. Linda Cross happened to be unlocking the entrance when they introduced themselves. From across the parking lot, I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. The color disappeared from her face almost instantly, and at that exact moment, I realized the story was no longer about defending my Thanksgiving dinner. It had become something much bigger than any of us had imagined. Watching federal investigators walk into the HOA office should have felt like the ending. But in reality, it was only the moment when everything hidden finally started coming into the light. For the next several weeks, the neighborhood became unusually quiet. People still waved while walking their dogs. Kids still rode bicycles through the cul-de-sacs after school. And lawns were still mowed every Saturday morning. But underneath that normal routine, everyone knew something had changed. Word spread quickly that investigators weren't just asking about my complaint. They were interviewing homeowners one by one, requesting years of meeting minutes, financial records, internal emails, enforcement logs, and every guest violation the board had ever issued. One afternoon, I saw Rebecca Collins leaving Maria Alvarez's house carrying a thick folder. The following morning, she spent nearly 2 hours speaking with Dr. Hassan. By the end of the week, 12 different homeowners had been interviewed. Each conversation revealed another piece of the same pattern. Different families, different holidays, different excuses. The same selective enforcement. Linda Cross stopped making eye contact with anyone. For years, she had walked through the neighborhood with the confidence of someone who believed the rules protected her authority. Now she moved quickly from her car to the HOA office without saying a word. A mutual neighbor later told me the board had already hired outside attorneys. Emergency meetings were happening almost every night, and insurance representatives were suddenly asking uncomfortable questions. The irony wasn't lost on me. The board had threatened me with lawyers over Thanksgiving dinner. Now they were spending thousands of dollars trying to explain years of decisions they had never expected anyone to examine. 73 days after that certified letter arrived in my mailbox, another certified envelope showed up. This one didn't come from the HOA. It came from the federal government. I sat at the same kitchen table where this entire story had begun, opened the envelope, and quietly read every page before saying a single word. The findings were exactly what the evidence had suggested from the beginning. The investigation concluded that the association had engaged in a continuing pattern of discriminatory housing practices through selective guest enforcement and intrusive information requests directed disproportionately toward multicultural households and homeowners with ethnic backgrounds. The settlement required the HOA to pay $89,000 in federal penalties, complete mandatory fair housing training, submit to annual compliance reporting, accept long-term federal monitoring, and revise every enforcement policy related to guest restrictions. Even more telling, Linda Cross resigned before the agreement became public. 2 additional board members stepped down within the following month, and the management company quietly terminated its contract with the association rather than remain connected to the investigation. A few weeks later, the HOA mailed me another letter. It was considerably shorter than the first one. Every fine against my property had been withdrawn. Every legal fee was reimbursed. Every reference to guest registration requirements had been removed from my file. There wasn't a single apology anywhere in the letter, but honestly, I didn't need one. Accountability means much more than apologies ever will. The following Thanksgiving felt different in ways I still have trouble describing. My brother came back with his family. My daughter brought friends again. Frank wandered over carrying his usual pecan pie, claiming his wife had baked 2 by accident, even though everyone knew she made the extra one every year just for us. Maria stopped by with homemade tamales. Dr. Hassan arrived carrying enough baklava to feed half the neighborhood. Children ran through the backyard chasing a football while grandparents argued over whose recipe deserved credit for dessert. At one point, I stood quietly on the back porch listening to all those conversations blending together, different accents, different backgrounds, different generations, all sharing one table without asking permission from anyone. That's what neighborhoods are supposed to look like. Not controlled, not monitored, simply lived in. Every now and then, someone asks whether I regret reporting the HOA. They usually expect me to talk about the stress, the paperwork, the months of uncertainty. But that's never the first thing that comes to mind. What I remember most is that phone call where someone actually believed they had the right to decide which families belonged and which visitors deserved scrutiny. If nobody challenges that kind of thinking, it doesn't disappear, it grows. Communities don't become stronger because people stay silent. They become stronger when ordinary homeowners understand that rules are supposed to protect everyone equally, not become weapons for whoever happens to hold the clipboard. I still live in Willow Creek Preserve today. The streets look almost exactly the same as they did before all this happened, but somehow they feel different. Maybe it's because people smile a little more often. Maybe it's because nobody worries about who parks in their driveway during the holidays anymore. Or maybe it's because everyone learned that even the smallest abuse of power can have consequences when someone decides not to look away. Now, I'd really like to hear what you think. Did the HOA cross a line the moment they demanded a guest list? Or should communities have that kind of authority in the name of security? If you were in my position, would you have ignored the letter, fought back privately, or done exactly what I did? Share your thoughts and your own HOA stories in the comments, because some of the most unbelievable neighborhood battles I've ever heard didn't happen in courtrooms. They started with one neighbor believing they were above everyone else. And if you enjoy real stories about ordinary people standing up to abusive power through patience, evidence, and the law, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.